Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. 40 years ago, William F. Buckley, Jr. wrote a book called God and Man at Yale. That book complained that America's institutions of higher learning were indoctrinating their students with socialism and atheism, instead of Mr. Buckley's preferred nostrums of free enterprise and Christianity. The book caused a tremendous fuss, and Mr. Buckley's career as a professional controversialist was underway. 4 decades later, Dinesh D'Souza has written a new book called Illiberal Education, subtitled The Politics of Race and Sex on Campus. Like Mr. Buckley, Mr. D'Souza paints a dire portrait of left-wing influence at American universities. Like Mr. Buckley, he analyzes college curriculum and finds it permeated with twisted doctrines, multiculturalism and deconstructionism this time, rather than anything as straightforward as socialism and atheism. Unlike Mr. Buckley, Mr. D'Souza also explores other aspects of university life, such as admissions policy, which he finds poisoned by racial preference, and freedom of speech, which he finds to be smothered by speech codes intended to protect racial sensitivity. Mr. D'Souza's book, in short, is the Bible of the campaign against what has come to be called political correctness on college campuses. And Mr. D'Souza himself has become that campaign's hero, a William F. Buckley for the 1990s. Born in India, Mr. D'Souza attended Dartmouth, where he helped to found the notorious conservative Dartmouth Review and worked as a domestic policy analyst in the Reagan White House. Mr. Buckley, there is one big difference between your book and Mr. D'Souza's. He claims to be battling against the stifling orthodoxy in the name of liberalism and tolerance. You were arguing for a university's right and duty to promote the truth as it determines the truth and impose that truth on students. Now, who's right about this, you or Mr. D'Souza?
Well, I'm not here to argue our differences. I'd be glad to cope with them as they arise. It seems to me that to the extent that university is engaged in the pursuit of the truth, which they are all ostensibly engaged in doing, there's not much point in apprehending the truth unless you do the relevant thing concerning its opposite, which is to discourage it. But that's why, for instance, I wouldn't go so far as to say that Christianity was a nostrum, or even capitalism is no more a nostrum than the bread that goes to feed the hungry who have capitalism to thank for its abundance. But it is true that Mr. D'Souza's fascinating book treats a number of issues that I didn't treat, and let's sort of talk about them. To begin with, let's just spend a couple of minutes, which is all we need to do, to document that the quota system is in fact working. Affirmative action means now something very different from what it used to mean. That's correct?
Well, to give you an example, at the University of California in Berkeley, I asked the admissions director a very simple question, which is to imagine the case of an applicant who has a grade average, a high school grade average of an A-, say a standardized test score of about 1,200 out of 1,600, and that student were Hispanic. What would be the probability he or she would be accepted to Berkeley? And he replied the probability would be 100%. I said, what if the same student with the same grades, the same test scores, and the same extracurriculars were like me, an Asian, or were white? What would be the probability that he or she would get in to Berkeley? And he replied, the probability would be 5%. So we see that universities do have institutionalized racial preference programs, which have tremendous implications involving affecting racial separatism on campus and affecting the whole debate about the curriculum.
Well, now, has anyone in the 2 or 3 months since your book came out challenged you in respect of that finding, or do they go on and justify it?
The finding is really uncontested,
okay.
But it's strange because it's not, the policy is rarely justified. There is not a single university leader in the country who is actively, vigorously, and publicly defending racial preferences. In fact, the latest case at Georgetown University, where a student publicized information, limited but valuable data, showing the existence of racial preferences, the university's strategy was to say, look, he has published confidential information. He published no names, only data. And second, they said that he has published partial information. So I invited them. I said, well, why don't you publish full information? And they said, no, no, no. Instead, they instituted disciplinary proceedings against him, and I read today that he was given a mild penalty. So this is an issue that is not resolved with argument, but often with coercion and with suppression of discussion. That's unhealthy.
Well, there seems to me some sort of an embarrassment about it, which must be why it is a necessary part of the general theater to ascribe SAT scores that are simply fictitious. The norm, whatever, I forget the term they use for it.
Race norming.
Sorry?
Race norming?
Race norming, yeah.
Well, there is a kind of Philistine attack on test scores, and the argument is, of course, that test scores are biased. This argument would have moderate plausibility if the test scores simply applied to the verbal section of the SAT, but of course the SAT also has a math section, and it's very hard to argue that algebra is biased against blacks or that equations are rigged against Hispanics. And the same gaps that we see on the verbal section of the test are mirrored or duplicated on the math section. The point I'm trying to make is that these tests are accurately measuring differences of academic performance, and they are pointing to other problems, terrible public schools, that we need to address. But instead of addressing those problems, we are directing unhealthy criticism at the test.
Okay, now, let's then take that as postulated and go on to ask the following question. Given that current data establish that if you go into college, you earn much more money in the course of your life than if you haven't gone to college, is that an excuse for lubricating access to colleges by people who wouldn't otherwise make it competitively? Or do you accost that point in your book?
Well, that's based on a common misimpression about affirmative action. Most people think that preferential admissions or that affirmative action increases the number of minority students in higher education. In fact, the number of minority kids in higher education has not increased. It has remained constant. In fact, in some years it has declined. Affirmative action does not change the total number. It simply decides placement. My argument is that a student who has the grades and test scores, the academic preparation, to be accepted to Virginia Community College is accepted via preferences to the University of Virginia. And the kid who has the academic preparation for UVA is accepted to Berkeley. And the kid with the academic preparation for Berkeley is accepted to Princeton. So there is there's a ratcheting up effect that is an important factor explaining the very high minority dropout rates. Black and Hispanic dropout rates in this country are dramatically higher than those for whites and Asians. And one reason is that affirmative action is misplacing a number of minority students throughout the system.
Well, now, why isn't that self-correcting? That is to say, what is the point of admitting students into Dartmouth or Yale who are going to flunk out and go to less exacting colleges? Or is it your point that they don't go there, they simply are permanently disillusioned from any academic pursuits?
Some of them drop out. A few of those return to college and get a degree later, but obviously if one goes to Berkeley and 5 years later fails to get a degree and drops out, there is an element of disillusionment, and I think it's fair to say that the student is worse off than had he or she gone to an institution where the grades and test scores would be competitive, where the student would be evenly matched against his or her peers, and where the graduation rates would be much better.
But most of the people I'm talking about drop out at the end of freshman year or sophomore year.
That's right.
They don't go 5 years.
The argument that the universities make is that we are giving these students a chance. It's true that many of them may not succeed, but everyone has been given the opportunity to succeed. Yet the problem is that at very selective colleges like Berkeley, like Stanford, like Princeton, the other students in the class are tremendously good. And one of the problems is that when professors at good schools take for granted that young people know an awful lot of stuff. They say things like, we expect you to know that Milton wrote Paradise Lost. We expect you to know something about the amoeba. We expect you to be able to do an equation. We expect you to read Hamlet by Monday. Not an easy task. Reading Shakespeare is a kind of acquired taste. And when universities practice preferential admissions, and when students are given these sorts of assignments, and are competitively outmatched by their peers. There's a great temptation to believe that the reason I'm experiencing some difficulty in reading Hamlet by Monday is not because I'm not well enough prepared, but is because Shakespeare was a white male. So there's a temptation to ascribe the problem to the curriculum and to argue, look, the curriculum has to be overhauled, and if only the curriculum reflected a non-Western or minority or third world perspective, this would make it more amenable or accessible to minority students.
Well, of course, that's a disreputable argument, and one is entitled to a certain amount of confidence that arguments of that level of sophistry can't make out for very long. You know, if anybody says that Bach wrote bad music, you know, one prays for him or laughs at him or whatever. One doesn't worry much about the fate of Bach.
But the argument is not that Bach wrote bad music, but that Bach wrote white male music, and that in a curriculum that is open to all groups, there should be equal representation or proportional representation for other forms of music entitled to no less legitimacy than Bach.
Yes, but of course that gets into the way of the principal operative axiom of the melting pot society, which is that people of your ethnic background and of mine and of Michael's and everybody in this room can adapt to a culture and exploit its special resources. To say that because you were born an Asian, you can't appreciate the music of Bach is to make an assertion that's a commitment to the kind of separatism that makes cohesion within a single social boundary almost inconceivable, isn't it?
Well, I agree with that completely, and in fact I feel it profoundly demeaning to say that, for example, that I would have less of an ability to apprehend Homer than white males. Most white males that I know are notably lacking in Homeric qualities and don't have any special access to the Greeks that I'm aware of.
Or affinity.
Or affinity for.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing, though, is that the melting pot, this notion of a common culture, a shared ideal, a kind of a collective pursuit of truth, this ideal has been set aside, in fact openly abandoned in many university campuses. And universities, even though their catalogs talk about integration, about bringing people together, in practice they routinely recognize and subsidize a very wide array of minority separatist groups. At Cornell University, I list in my book 25 or 30 distinctive groups. And it goes beyond that. A number of campuses now have separate residential and eating facilities for minorities. There is the University of Pennsylvania, which has funded a black yearbook called Positively Black, in which black kids appear in the black yearbook and other kids appear in the general yearbook. And it's quite routine on campuses to have minority orientation. So when you come to class, when you come to college, the minority kids are isolated and have a separate minority orientation. And everyone else has a general orientation. So this separatism is now rife on American campuses.
Well, to what extent do you consider it an obligation of a society that's multiracial in its ambitions to emphasize the evils of endogamy? Is it necessarily bad for blacks in a campus to want to room with other blacks? Do you consider this an inherent gesture, an inherently hostile gesture?
I don't think it's inherently evil, but I do think it creates a double standard. If there was a college fraternity that said, look, we are a white pride organization, we limit our membership to whites, we promote white culture, this would be a tremendous outrage. The university would seek to dismantle the group, to expel the students, or at least to denounce the idea. And I think it should. I mean, this country, since Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, has entered a kind of public commitment to desegregation, to an attempt to bring people together. And yet, in the same vein, while the university takes that position on the one hand, on the other hand, as I said, it routinely recognizes and encourages minority separatism. It's very hard to give an explanation for why segregation is all right in the one case but not in the other. There's a double standard that's hard to justify.
Well, no, I see your point that the colleges, the colleges face paradoxical orientations here, but It's one thing for a college to say, look, like Martin Luther King, we think there should be an evanescence of color. People ought to notice whether you're brown or black or white. It's another thing to say, so strongly do we believe this that we are going to refuse a black permission to room with another black. He's going to have to room with someone who's white. Because it seems to me the exercise of authority at that level means that they have the authority to ban an all-male club, and authority that that part of me, which is libertarian, seems to resist. I don't think it's a part of a free society to require people to do other than that which they are inclined to do, so long as it isn't aggressive.
I think the argument is one of degree. I think for any immigrant group, for any minority group, one to some degree wants to protect and sustain and cherish one's own identity at the same time that one partakes in the larger culture.
Yeah.
I can say, for example, that I will not date anybody except an Indian. That would be racially discriminatory. I would be discriminating against whites, and I'd be discriminating against blacks and in favor of Indians. But I'm sure this would not create national outrage, because the feeling would be that on a matter of so private a preference, no problem, do what you want.
Your will should be sovereign.
That's right. Yeah. So the argument about separatism does not hinge on voluntary association. A group of black kids want to room together or eat together, that's okay. I think the problem is when the university gets into the practice of subsidizing such a degree of separatism that you establish virtual ethnic enclaves, that there's not a lot of interaction among groups. Incidentally, this undermines one of the major arguments in favor of affirmative action, which was precisely that by having a very diverse student body, you would have a robust interchange of perspectives that would enrich the academic community more generally.
Well, but since if we are in pursuing now that which is distinctive to different ethical backgrounds or different cultures, we run into a problem singled out by one of your, well, I wouldn't call him one of your critics, because for the most part he admired what you did. Professor Genovese did write the main academic justification for ethnic studies lies in a substantial body of specialized scholarship that cannot simply be integrated into existing disciplines, as Jacob Nessner has written of Jewish studies. These have legitimate claims on our scholarly attention. Now, do you understand him to be saying, for instance, what in respect of Indian culture, to what extent can a study of Indian culture, which you would applaud, proceed without the need to be, so to speak, assimilated in a program that spoke of cultures in the Western context?
I understand him to be saying something I completely agree with, which is that it's perfectly okay to study distinctive national cultures. In fact, this is not a new fact. In the old canon, years back, you could study, you could major in Middle Eastern studies, you could major in Arab studies, you could major in Chinese philosophy. There's nothing wrong with this. I'm not arguing that the disciplines need to be somehow welded together. My chapter on Afro-American studies and women's studies, in which I do a kind of careful case study of Harvard, makes a different argument. I argue not that there is no room for these departments. In fact, I think the study of subjects like slavery and women's issues is quite legitimate. The argument is the inherent dogmatism, the ideological dogmatism, or perhaps the politically correct approach that is routinely enforced in these programs. This is a criticism with which Eugene Genovese himself, a Marxist, agrees. In fact, he argues that there is not a single women's studies program in the entire country that he knows of
Emory.
that has an anti-feminist or a non-feminist teaching there.
Yeah.
Emory, which is, of course, headed by his wife, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, he said would be open to hiring one. But I don't think most other places would be. And in these disciplines, one of the problems is that there is an approach to knowledge that tends to decide the outcome. For example, Jeff Hart, our mutual friend, my professor, used to joke that when he first heard about the French Revolution, his reaction was that he was against it. And of course, the interesting thing, though, is that you can be against it. That if you are in a history class and you write a paper, you can say, I agree with Burke, the whole thing was a mistake, or I agree with Paine. But not in women's studies. There's a series of, the discipline tends to view history as a series of emancipatory acts for women. And so if you are in women's studies and you take a hostile view of Roe versus Wade, for example, I bet you a student would feel rather uncomfortable.
No, I think you're right. There's a lot of attitudinizing on the intellectual franchise that goes on. But to take Professor Stephen Thurnstorm, who at Harvard taught about the South before the Civil War, recited the nature of Jim Crow, even as a documentary today might do, and found himself completely boycotted as a result of his doing this. I had a professor who said, and this is analogous, pointing out the irresponsibility of that kind of protest, that you know, a doctor going in to get an inflamed appendix doesn't say, "I'll get you, you son of a bitch," as he goes down with a scalpel. He's entirely clinical in his approach to the problem. By the same token, it hardly needs to be suggested that one approves of Jim Crow to describe how Jim Crow actually worked, or even occasionally to describe a gentle and loving act by a slaveholder, of which let's assume there were thousands, given that we know who some of those people were. But I think Genovese is saying that you don't, in your book, accommodate the special dispensation that's necessary for a genuine exposure to these alien cultures. Now, I happen not to know what he means when he refers to Jack Nessner and his complaint, though I know Nessner's worked pretty well. Do you?
I think perhaps the argument is that in the unique case of American blacks, one cannot count them as other immigrants. Of course, blacks were not voluntary immigrants. They were brought here in chains. And he might be saying that the black experience is unique. There is something distinctive about it. In fact, it reminds me of a quotation by W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that he sees the world through two different sets of eyes, as an American and as a black man, and there is conflict or tension between those two visions. That's the third pair of spectacles, perhaps. But the interesting thing is that is an interesting perspective, and I don't think there's anything in my book that denies its validity.
No, but okay, let's assume that that's all he is saying. But you are convinced that all that one needs to know about different cultures from our own can be taught, so to speak, at the same rhythm and with the same detachment with which that we apply to other disciplines and other cultures. You know, if we're going to study Elizabethan England, we can study sub-Saharan Africa without an invocation of theater that makes the one distinctively plausible.
I think that's right. I don't think that these special so-called studies programs should degenerate into a kind of ethnic cheerleading, which is in fact what many of them are. Yeah, they've become a kind of curricular counterpoint to the sensitivity education, which of course is nothing more than a kind of racial browbeating and exhortation. The good news is that non-Western cultures have produced important classics, and those are worthy of study. So young people today should know something about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. To do so, it's helpful to know something about the Quran. But that kind of approach is rarely pursued in multicultural education. Rather, it's a kind of anti-Western epithets and indoctrination.
Excuse me, Mr. D'Souza. Mr. Buckley, do you agree with Dinesh that it's an unjustifiable double standard for a university to support and nurture a black group on campus, but to refuse to do so for a white group? It seems to me it's a perfectly justifiable double standard. When I was at university, I belonged to a Jewish group, Hillel. The university encouraged it. I would have been horrified at the thought the university would encourage a group specifically designed to exclude Jews. There are sort of inclusive minority groups, and there are exclusive majority groups, and it seems to me that's not a perfectly comfortable, but a relatively easy distinction to make.
What a university encourages and what it discourages is a very, very tricky point, in part because I think students are at universities to learn. Now, we know that the same college you and I, the two colleges you and I graduated from, would not enroll a Jewish teacher in the faculty as late as 1938, 139. That wasn't all that long ago. And certainly wouldn't elect them to fraternities. Now, question, ought we to feel that the scholars of that and overseers at that age were obviously incompetent morally, or were they simply victims of an evolution in attitude of which we presumably are the beneficiaries, and maybe our great-grandchildren would be even more so? I'm a little bit suspicious about synthetic accelerations, because I think you run into the kind of problems Mr. D'Souza has been stressing.
But you're open to the possibility that this evolution has been a good thing and might evolve even further in the direction that Mr. D'Souza describes with a certain amount of horror.
Yeah.
We might come to approve of it,
Yeah.
20, 30 years from now.
I'm glad for the 54 decision of the Supreme Court, though constitutionally, I would, for constitutional reasons, I'd have voted against it. Thank you, Mr. D'Souza. What's the name of your book?
Illiberal Education.
Author of Illiberal Education. Thank you. Mr. Michael Kinsley, thank you, ladies and gentlemen of St. John's.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by